us here. All right.
You'll usually call me when you're ready to retire? When's that going to be? Yeah, I don't either.
Never. I have a 12-year-old.
Huh?
I have a 12-year-old.
Oh, you got a while.
Yeah. I'll re-career.
You're not going to get hit regardless of what you say. Where?
Ask us after the basketball game.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad y'all are here today. My name is Tom Albritton. I'm the director of the State Ethics Commission, and you are here for lobbyist training. As you know, the session starts next week, so your timing could not be better for this. Is anybody else registered to lobby in any other states or any other jurisdictions? All right, so you I take it, are registered in Louisiana and Florida. Okay, how about you?
Indiana, Vermont.
Okay. What you will find is that what we've got here is similar to what you find in most places. Vermont's a little bit different because they've only had an ethics commission for like 2 years. And I know that their director up there has been pretty busy trying to get things rolling up there. I actually sat next to him at a conference. Are you from up there? Where are you from?
No, I'm from East Tennessee, but originally I live in Birmingham now.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, their director's a super nice guy. If you're up in Vermont and you need anything, and but I know that when they patterned their code of ethics up there, they did borrow heavily from a lot of other states, and including us, and they all look pretty much the same. So if you are registered in other jurisdictions, most of this is going to be fairly familiar to you. There's nothing that we've got here that is just unique to Alabama, just made up just for Alabama. So between your experience in the federal system and in the state system, most of this is stuff you already know, okay? If you're attending by webinar, then please text any questions that you may have to the number that's on the screen. Now, what we will generally do is wait until the end of the presentation in order to answer those questions, just to make sure that we don't answer it in the course of it. Also, if you have technical difficulties, that's another thing you can text to us if you're attending by webinar. My code? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Now, keep in mind that everything that we say here is the floor, not the ceiling, for ethical conduct. You are more than welcome to go above and beyond what the basic requirements are here, and often people do. There are folks out there who do this, who stay as far back from the line as they possibly can, and generally it's those folks who we don't hear anything about. Okay, so there are plenty of examples out there of people who do treat it just as I said, as the floor, not the ceiling, and they go above and beyond to be compliant. Remember, any advice that I give in this seminar or any questions that I answer cannot be relied upon in any way that would give you legal protection from prosecution. This is general guidance only. If you have specific questions about the requirements under the Act, what's allowed, what's disallowed, what you should do, you should follow up directly with our office and ask those questions in the manner in which the Code of Alabama allows you to ask those questions. And if you do that, then you can get protection from prosecution, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Also, each of you has met Vicki Manning. She is our lobbyist liaison. She should be your contact for any questions that you've got. Most of you have probably already talked to Vicki at some point before you got here today. If you have, then you know how helpful she is. If you have not, I will tell you she is very helpful, but she is the one in our office who will guide you through these issues that we talk about today, especially with your filing requirements and your updates and your disclosures and all of that. So Vicki is your go-to person in our office, and use her heavily. She is, that's what she is there for. Okay. So any questions before we get started with any of this? All right. This event behind me, referencing this slide, has really been kind of an overarching event over the ethics law in Alabama for the last 4 years, and that was the prosecution and conviction of our former Speaker of the House. He was convicted for violations of the Act, and his case was appealed to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, which affirmed on some counts and reversed on one, and then it went to the Alabama Supreme Court, and everybody in the state's waiting to see what the Alabama Supreme Court does with this conviction. The reason that I've got this up here is to say that we, at this point, really don't know what the status of the law will be moving forward through the session. The Supreme Court has had it for quite a while. You hear rumors all the time that an opinion's about to come down. One hasn't yet. But depending on what the Supreme Court says, the law could go in any direction. They could declare parts of it unconstitutional. They could affirm it. We just don't know. So stay tuned. If you are not living in Alabama, but you are going to be coming in Alabama, just check on al.com or one of the other sources to kind of get the latest about what may be going on with this case. The key areas that you hear people talk about, though, are the areas that would be critically important to you as lobbyists, and that is what you can give public officials, what they can solicit, what they can receive, those sorts of things. The makeup of our commission is, and this is every place I have seen that's got a commission, and now I think every state does, now that North Dakota got an ethics commission, are set up basically the same way, and that is the commission is an appointed group of individuals who serve generally without compensation for staggered terms, and we are no different. We have 5 commissioners currently who are appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House to serve staggered 5-year terms. Our chair is Judge Charles Price. He's a retired circuit judge from here in Montgomery. Beverly Brady is a lawyer from Auburn, Alabama, who serves on our commission. John Plunk is a lawyer from Athens, Alabama, who is on the commission. Former Chief Justice Lynn Stewart recently came on. She's been with us for about 3 meetings now. Former Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. And we have Stan McDonald, who is a lawyer from Huntsville, Alabama, who's our newest appointee. Every session, though, we've got somebody who is going to roll off and a new commissioner appointed. There's no requirement that they be lawyers, although we currently have all of our commission members are lawyers. It's great that we've got retired circuit judge, and it's really great that we've got a retired Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court on there. The commission itself is strong, and if you have an issue coming before them, you can rest assured that you've got great minds who are going to be looking at this and making the official decisions for the commission. And the commissioners are the ones who do that. I work for them and manage a staff of 14 individuals presently. Any questions about our commissioners? Okay. We also have jurisdiction over the Fair Campaign Practices Act, but for your purposes day in and day out, you're going to be a lot more concerned with the Ethics Act than you are Fair Campaign Practices Act, unless you're making a political contribution. Okay, that's why we don't spend a lot of time talking about FCPA in this session. We have the ability to provide advice, and in fact, we're directed by the Code of Alabama to do so. If you have a question about whether certain conduct is allowed under the Act or prohibited by the Act, there is a mechanism for finding that answer. You can either do it through a formal advisory opinion, or you can get an informal opinion from the Commission. Has anybody here with any other jurisdiction in which you practice gotten an informal opinion from your Commission? You ever asked them to answer questions for you? And talking with folks who get training, yeah, it really kind of runs the gamut about what offices do. Our office gives out a lot of informal advice, and this past year, we gave out over 1,000 informal opinions. When I came on in 2015, we were giving out about 200 annually. So the amount of informal advice that we've given out has gone up dramatically. The amount of formal advisory opinions that we've given have gone up as well. On average, we're giving more, but we give fewer formal advisory opinions than informal opinions. In a good year, we'll give 20 plus formal opinions, and then again, I've given you the the stats on our informal opinions. So a natural question is when do you get an informal opinion and when do you get a formal advisory opinion? If you are asking a question that is easily answered either by one of our pre-existing advisory opinions or it's easily answerable from the clear language of the code itself, then that's something that we would recommend that you get through an informal opinion. So the kind of question that we get asked often by lobbyists are, I am one of the sponsors or I am with an association that is holding an educational function this summer and we've got a number of sponsors. How do we disclose those expenses? We've got an advisory opinion that sets out the process for doing that. So we would give you in an informal opinion that answer which we'd given in a previous formal advisory opinion. Now, the formal advisory opinion that I'm talking about and that Cynthia will give more information about in a little while came about though because the question arose whether lobbyists could aggregate certain expenses. And that's not something we had answered formally before. And the code gave some direction about how to disclose, but didn't answer that specific question. So we asked the principal that was putting on that function to ask us that question formally, which then gave us an opportunity to describe how you can delineate your expenses in that context. So I think that's a great example for you of when an informal opinion is good versus a formal advisory opinion. Also, if you're asking us to interpret language in the code that is not abundantly clear, what it means, then we would probably also tell you to request a formal advisory opinion. We get more questions informally and formally from people other than lobbyists, but we have been asked by lobbyists before to answer questions. Sometimes people will say, am I a lobbyist? You got somebody out there doing grassroots lobbying, and that's a common question we get asked, is whether grassroots lobbying qualifies as lobbying, and we have answered that before too. Or whether a citizen just expressing a viewpoint to their legislator qualifies as lobbying. We've answered that question too. So if you have any questions like that, I mean, y'all are all registered lobbyists, so you know you're a lobbyist. But we do get asked those kind of questions a lot by people who are trying to figure out whether they even come under the operation of our act. So any questions so far about any of that? The thing that, in practical guidance moving forward, what I would tell you is that if you have a question about whether you should or should not do something, if you can't get an email either to Cynthia, to me, just call Vicki, because what Vicki will do is then forward it to us. But if you're comfortable talking with Vicki and you're comfortable interacting with her because you have done it, just go to her and ask her the question. And it may be the kind of thing that doesn't need to be forwarded to the legal division. It may simply be, hey, I forgot to disclose this on my form. What do I do? That's a question Vicki can answer for you. What she will tell you to do is just get your form in. If you have to amend your form, if you have to amend your disclosures, that's fine. We want you to do that. We don't want you to get caught or be so afraid that you're going to get caught for not disclosing that you then double down and don't disclose something that you should have disclosed. So if you find yourself in that situation where your office overlooked something, or the person who was responsible for filing the form didn't have the right information or just simply messed up, don't be afraid to tell Vicki that, and she will help you get all that straight, okay? Otherwise, you can send it to, we've got a general email address that all questions go to that eventually make their way to us. Our turnaround on an informal opinion is about 14 days. Every now and then we get caught behind that. Sometimes we're much faster than that, but we tell everybody 14 days. On a formal advisory opinion, though, those can only be considered at a meeting of our commissioners, and they meet every 60 days. So we can only consider a formal advisory opinion every 60 days, which is another reason why sometimes people get an informal opinion. Okay. The key difference, though, between the two is an informal opinion does not give you the same legal protection that a formal advisory opinion gives you. By statute, a formal advisory opinion gives you protection from prosecution. And again, that's a pretty standard thing among jurisdictions. All right, that's our opinions process. Any questions about that? Everybody solid on that point? All right, good. Opinions have to be perspective only. We cannot give forgiveness for a past act through an advisory opinion. People will ask, hey, I did this, was that okay? We really can't answer that question because the conduct's already occurred. Our advice can only be prospective. So think about these issues early and often if you can, and get the questions to us. Okay. There's also a rule that all of our informal advice has to be in writing. Your request has to be in writing, and the answer has to be in writing. So we can't just answer the questions on the phone. However, if you are in town and you have a question that you want answered, feel free to stop by the office. Just know eventually we're going to have to get this put down in writing, okay, before we ever give you any kind of answer. But email is fine with us. I've even had folks before. I had somebody get up with me on a Friday night about a question about something that was going to happen Monday morning, and I said, look, just text it to me, and then I just converted that into an email and sent it to my email, and then just answered it that way. Don't be afraid to just shout at us any way that you can, and we'll get it into the proper channels. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna skip over that. You need to understand that intentional violations of the ethics law are Class B felonies, meaning they are punishable by up to between 2 and 20 years in prison and a fine of up to $20,000 per violation. That's just for intentional violations. Other violations of our act are criminal misdemeanors. However, the commission does have wide authority to issue fines, and we've been doing a lot more of that over the last 2 years. The legislature gave us the authority to fine for what is a defined term, minor violations, and those are violations that the dollar amount is not very high, and for public officials it can't exceed $1,500. In other words, their gain cannot be more than $1,500, or the loss to a public entity cannot be greater than $1,500 if you're a public official. But for all other public employees, we can fine as long as certain criteria are met. And again, to summarize them, it's that there's not a great deal of money involved or skill involved in the crime, and we can fine up to $6,000 per violation. But all of these cases have to start with a complaint, and the complaint has to be in writing. It's got to be signed by the individual who filed it. We can't take anonymous complaints. And if a complaint is filed with us, which alleges a violation of the ethics law, then we will present that case to our commission. Our commissioners sit as a grand jury of sorts, weigh the evidence, determine whether it's more likely than not that there's been a violation. If they determine that it is more likely than not that there's been a violation, they will refer it to the Attorney General's Office for prosecution or to the appropriate district attorney, who will then pick it up and investigate it and decide whether to present it to a grand jury. Okay, so that's the mechanisms of enforcement that we have under our act. Any questions about that process? We have to resolve all cases filed with us within 180 days, although we can get a one-time extension of an additional 180 days from our commissioners. So the most that a case can be pending in our office is 360 days. Okay? Statute of limitations for violations is 4 years for intentional violations and 2 years for a misdemeanor. If I had to summarize the act, it would be under this theme, that a public employee or a public official cannot use their official position to provide personal gain for themselves, their family members, or a business they're associated with. Okay, that's in a nutshell what this act covers. Now, there are specific provisions that relate to the relationship between lobbyists and public officials and public employees. And they are prohibitions on transferring what's called a thing of value between lobbyists and public officials, and the soliciting of the same from public officials to lobbyists or the entities that retain the lobbyist. Again, that term thing of value is something that should be vaguely familiar to you if you've practiced in other jurisdictions, because that's not something that we made up in Alabama. I mean, that's a phrase that is borrowed from other jurisdictions and other bodies of law. It is defined in our code to include a gift, favor, benefit, service, gratuity, basically anything of financial value that it can either be requested or given to a public official. So meals come under this definition, although there are exceptions that allow meals in certain contexts. grants of money, just straight out giving money would be covered under this. Football tickets, that's another big thing. That is specifically provided in the definition of thing of value. It was put in there, not surprisingly, because of the Alabama-Auburn game, I have been told. But I'll be honest with you, and since the time I've been here, where that comes up more often, and this is just a great example of kind of some unintended consequences of the words that are thrown into this. It comes up at the county level and the local level. I mean, people want to know whether they can give free tickets to their school board members to attend the high school football game and things. And so we've got some advisory opinions that have fleshed that out too. But although it generally applies to things that are reducible to a dollar amount, and I really haven't seen an example yet of something that would be a thing of value that has not been able to be reduced down to some monetary kind of figure. It does have the word favor in there. I think most people interpret that to mean a favor that can be reducible down, quantified somehow financially, but there is some loose language in there. So if you have something that falls on the fringes and you're not sure whether it is a thing of value, that's the kind of thing to ask for guidance for moving forward. Y'all probably aren't going to be dealing with that, because what you're going to be dealing with are the primary tools that lobbyists use when they deal and interact with public officials, and that is, if you give them anything, it is going to be in the context of some kind of hospitality. It is going to be some kind of widely attended event that has refreshments and hors d'oeuvres, beverages, that sort of thing, and there are specific allowances for that in the code. But most of the questions we get asked from y'all are going to be within that context. But if you have something that falls on the outside, that's a great question to ask of us.
So does an invoice have to be provided?
No, because if it falls within,
Keeping track of whether or not this thing of value was back given or paid for.
well, if it falls within, well, let me start out. If it does not fall within one of the exceptions, then you can't do it. But there are 18 exceptions. So if it falls within one of the exceptions, you don't have to keep up with the invoice, except to the extent that what you're giving may exceed $250 in a 24-hour period. Okay, so if it falls within one of those exceptions, and that advisory opinion Cynthia will talks about that $250 limit, where you would need to be really sensitive to that. Most of your legislative receptions are not going to fall over $250. I have not seen one yet that it was more than $250 a person attending. I mean, sure, it could happen, and if it did, you would have to disclose that. Where it generally comes up is when you have an educational function where you're giving rooms to public officials who are going to be participating in the conference, maybe as a speaker, and the room itself may be $250, and you're giving meals on top of that, so you're exceeding that $250 in a 24-hour period. Yeah, so don't sweat that too much, but you need to know how much you're spending, simply so that you know you're not exceeding that 250 cap. With a lot of the legislative receptions too, when people ask for us to approve those, which we can do and which I'll talk about in a second, they already kind of know per head what that's costing, and they'll throw that in the letter too, if for no other reason than to let us know that they're falling under that amount, is to also publicly state that they're not exceeding that 250. Every now and then, this is a much longer answer than the very simple question that you asked, so thank you for indulging me. Every now and then, though, that you will have an event come up that, for example, a member of the press will be very interested in because maybe they heard that it was going on. And so if it is out of town and involves hotel rooms and all of that, and they are able to check and see that the room was in excess of $200 a night, it could just create a headache for you when you later come back and say, well, we didn't expend that much on them because of A, B, or C. So you really do want to, certainly in an event like that, be mindful of how much you're spending in case you ever have to show why you didn't violate the act to somebody outside of us who may question it. Okay. Somewhere in there, did I answer your question sufficiently? Okay. Also remember that it doesn't matter how much it is or what it is, if you're giving it to the public official to corruptly influence their official action, you can't do it. So they can't use their official position for their personal gain. In other words, they can't use that official position as leverage. You can't give them a thing of value unless it fits within one of the specific exceptions. but under no circumstances can you give them anything to try to get them to act in a corrupt manner officially, okay, to achieve a result that they would not otherwise achieve but for the corrupting influence over them. Okay, the clearest example of that would be bribery, sack of money on their desk. This is what I want you to do, and we will give you this money for it. People often joke, yeah, well, you can do that if it's a campaign contribution. But remember that even campaign contributions cannot be tied to specific action. So that notion of corruption is mirrored in the FCPA too. So if there is a motivation there to corruptly influence them, it's going to be a violation of our act, regardless of what it is you're giving them. There's also a provision in our act that says that they can't solicit you for anything except a campaign contribution. It is the clearest portion of our act. Everybody, when they talk about our act, says we need clarity, we need clarity, we need clarity. And we throw this up and say, you've got clarity in 23C. It's 3625-23C. And it says this: no public official, public employee shall solicit anything from a lobbyist, regardless of whether it is a thing of value, for any purpose other than a campaign contribution. So they will say, well, does that mean I can't say, hey, I want you to take me out to dinner even if it's under the amount? That's right. You cannot be solicited for anything under 23C. Now, you can offer within the exceptions, but you can't be solicited. Okay? Any questions about that? Any questions about any of that? You know all this, Jim. You've been through this at least twice already. Yeah, you've been through our informal opinion process. That's that worked okay? Okay. Anything you want to pass on about that to anybody else in attendance? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I think online it's been very, very good. Done that just to brush up. It's nothing like being in person. Yet I've served as probate judge in the county and member of the association and witness and stuff. I was a mental health commissioner, and now I'm a lobbyist. So
Right.
I don't know which base I had to touch.
Right. That written requirement, the requirement that our informal opinions have to be in writing, have been helpful for us too, because it's made us aware of what we've told other people. Let's say that you walk in and ask the same question he asked 6 months ago. We've got pretty good recall for the questions that have been asked. And we'll say, what did I tell Jim Perdue? And I'll look at it, and often I'll just take the advice that we've given in one informal opinion and just copy it over into yours, because we want to make sure that we're being consistent in what we're saying. It's also pretty good because they're very quick to say, well, you told so-and-so that they could do it, and I can pull up and either say, yeah, we did tell them that, or no, we didn't. Actually, this is what we said. So anyway, I'm glad that that's worked okay for you. Most bodies of law that touch on ethics have a de minimis cutoff. There's certain things that we just don't worry about. In Alabama, that's the case too. If the item is less than $25, then it is an exception to the definition of thing of value. You should know that there is a separate exception that applies to you too for meals. This is an items exception, just very low level things. It's meant to kind of facilitate just the normal kind of everyday actions between people. If you're picking up something that is less than $25, no one should sweat it. And again, unless it's to corruptly influence. I've always got to put that disclaimer out there. But for meals, as a lobbyist, you have a $25 per meal separate exception and an annual cap of $150. And your principal has a $50 per meal with a $250 cap. So your principal can spend $50 a pop, you can spend $25 a pop. You can't stack those together, but you separately have those limits. So any questions about that? I have not found an example of the things that y'all really typically want to do in the course of the session that there's not an exception that applies for. There's plenty of leeway in here for the legislative receptions and all of that. So you should have some comfort moving forward that there are events you can plan. If you have not done it before, then either talk to other lobbyists or go on our website, because we've got examples of the things we have approved But just know that there are allowances here, and we're happy to help you find where those allowances are within the code. Skipping over that. All right, now I'm going to turn this over to our general counsel at this time, who will discuss these issues in a bit more detail.
Hi, is my mic on? Yes, okay.
Yeah, it is.
Hello, everybody, how are you? As he said, I'm Cynthia Ralston, I'm the lawyer. Okay, so Tom talked about thing of value, and there's 18 exceptions. So the exceptions that matter to y'all the most are the ones regarding, events that you invite legislators, public officials, or public employees to. Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize that for you because they're not always consistent. So the three exceptions you're worried about are the widely attended event, the educational function, and the economic development function. This is where there are exceptions to the definition of thing of value, so it's something you're allowed to give to the public official or public employee. Does that make sense? Okay. So you need to know what these things are. A widely attended event is a gathering, dinner, reception, other event where it's reasonably expected that more than 12 individuals with a diversity of views would be present. It can be 12 accountants, but 12 people, it's assumed, would have a diversity of views. Okay, so a conference with people who are all in the same field would still present a diversity of views if there's more than 12 people. Educational function, I won't read all of this to you, but it's defined. It is what you think it is. It's a conference that you go to that, we go to conferences that are sponsored by the University of Alabama. And whenever I say to people, a principal is putting on this conference, they're, it's fine. It's likely pre-certified and it's an educational function and the swag you get is likely de minimis anyway. But nonetheless, it's just something people don't think about as regularly, but a conference would include that. It also has to be, it's interesting, this is actually language from the statute that says that everything taken with the totality of the program cannot reasonably be perceived as subterfuge for a purely social, recreational, or entertainment function. And that's statutory. So that supports the advisory opinions that we have that says you can't pretend that it's an educational function. It has to actually be educational to some extent, okay? Economic development function, again, it's what you think it is. It's about economic development. So transportation and lodging for a widely attended event and an educational function. This can include a public employee or a public official's spouse, all right? That is not so for an economic development function. I don't know why, but it's not included in that section of the exception to thing of value. But so you can pay actual necessary expenses. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean that if I'm going to a conference and my participation is speaking on day 3 of a 5-day conference, that my transportation lodging, unless I'm attending the entire conference, can be from the night before the conference starts to the day after it's over, and I do my hour spiel, and then I'm just sort of hanging out, okay? Because you have to meaningfully participate, and this is also in the code. They have to be a speaker or panel participant, presenting information related to their agency, performing an appropriate ceremonial function, or their attendance is appropriate to their official duties or representative function. All right. If I speak and I'm attending the function, that's important. You can pay for their registration fees, but the actual necessary expenses for my actual participation is what's covered. Economic development also is actual and necessary expenses. It's just that spouses are not included, and the participation level, that definition is not in that exception. So hospitality, this includes all 3: widely attended event, educational function, and economic development. Hospitality, food, and beverages that are in an integral part, such as a luncheon, banquet, reception. This is going to be sort of, you have a conference that starts, early on 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the sponsor invites everybody to come the day before, and there's a hospitality reception, with a band or something, the night before the conference. That's an integral part of the conference. It's kind of the beginning, the kickoff of the conference, okay? That would be considered an integral part. And I meant to take, I've got something I meant to take out of the presentation. I'll get to that in a minute, but, okay. Outside of those, okay, so widely attended event, educational, economic, there is, as Tom described, I think he did, a food and beverage exception. So if you, as a lobbyist, if you want to take a public official or public employee out, you can do that and spend $25. It doesn't matter if it's a part of an event or anything else, it's $25. That exception is separate from the three I just discussed, okay? So that's $25 for a lobbyist, up to $150 for the year for that particular employee. If you were taking, me out for lunch, you could do that 6 times for $150 for the year, or $50 for a principal, up to $250 a year. All right, is everybody kind of familiar with that exception? Okay. So the pre-certification, this is an independent, this is one of the 18 exceptions to the thing of value definition. So any function or activity pre-certified by the director of the Ethics Commission as a function that meets any of the above criteria, which include the widely attended event, educational function, and economic development. So that's what Tom talks about when he says pre-certification. We have the, once you send it in, we'll let you know if we need more information. I'm going to tell you what we need in just a second. I'm going to do a bullet point of that. If we need more, we'll get more. And then once it's pre-certified, it goes on our website, and anybody can look at it that wants to see it. And they can see the invitation list and everything else that's included. That's the intention of pre-certification, so that it's a public document and there's transparency in that event. Okay, so the pre-certifications. If you're going to have an educational function, it needs to be all of these things. Meeting, event, or activity organized around a formal program or agenda, that it has educational or informational speeches, debates, panel discussions, or other presentations, and concerning a matter within the scope of the participant's official duties. A widely attended event has to be a gathering, dinner, reception, or other event of mutual interest of a number of parties, reasonably expected that more than 12 individuals will attend with a diversity of views. And it cannot just be a standalone hunting or fishing trip. That is not a widely attended event, even if there's 12 people with a diversity of views. You just can't, it can't be all recreational. What we're going to need to know for the widely attended event is the list of public officials or employees that are invited. If there's less than 50 people, a sign-in sheet of who participated, and how many people do you expect to attend? Because obviously it's, like any party, you invite people, you expect about 50% to come, or whatever percentage, but we need to know kind of how many people you have invited to see if there's actually expected 12. And then you're going to have to tell us what you're paying for, all the things I just talked about. Actual necessary transportation expenses, lodging expenses. Are you waiving a registration fee for a participant? Are they a public official, a public employee, or a spouse? We already went over this, that they have to actually meaningfully participate, okay? Integral part. This is not defined in our act, but I kind of pulled a few bullets from the opinions we have, the conglomeration of opinions we have about this. The food and beverage must be an integral part. So we've said it cannot stand alone, independent from the event. It must be in conjunction with the event in some way. And it says all attendees must be invited. That's not exactly true. It has to include attendees from the event, okay? Whether it's 150 people that are at the event, whether they're all necessarily invited is not necessarily a requirement, but that is going to be on a case-by-case basis. And then sanctioned by sponsors of the event. Okay, so the sponsors are having the hospitality the night before, right? Okay, it has to be done 10 days before the event. We can't change this. It's a administrative rule, so it has to be requested more than 10 days before the event. And pre-certification is not required. It can be an exception to the thing listed as an exception to a thing of value and not be pre-certified. It doesn't mean that because I've had people say, oh my gosh, my boss is going to kill me, I didn't get this pre-certified. It doesn't mean that everybody's violating the act just because they go to this event. It can still be an exception. It's just that we didn't pre-certify it, all right? But try to get those to us as quickly as you can, and we'll get them turned around. This is what our website looks like for pre-certifications. And these are a few opinions that will matter to y'all. So when we talk about the food and beverage expenditures outside of the widely attended event and all that, the $25 and $50 limits for lobbyists and principals, you can't stack those. So if two lobbyists in this room go to take a public official to lunch, you have different issues that you are approaching the public official about. Y'all can't spend a combined $50 on that public official, okay? The public official is only getting $25. $25 worth of a meal, all right? You can't stack, and you can't do that with your principal either. Yes?
So if you have to
No, it doesn't matter. I really should frame this from the perspective of the public official or public employee. They're only getting $25 worth or $50 worth, depending on whether it's a lobbyist taking them or a principal taking them. So you can't have a big group of people take somebody out and spend, $300 on them for dinner, all right? But so we call that stacking. There's no de minimis lobbying in Alabama. If you meet the definition of lobbying, you have to register as a lobbyist, no matter how little lobbying you do. Sporting and recreational events that are not an integral part are not an exception to the thing of value. So dinners. So even though it may not be an official part of the conference, this is what I'm talking about the reception or dinner before the conference. If it's an event that takes place close to the beginning or the close of the conference or the beginning of a conference day when nothing else is going on, so no other conference activities can be taking place, and it consists of individuals attending the conference and it's sanctioned by the sponsors, then it doesn't violate the act. Okay. This is the aggregate. I think you may have been addressing this or asking this question earlier to Tom, but if you have multiple sponsors that sponsor an event, as y'all know, if you spend $250 or more in a 24-hour period on a public official or public employee, you have to report that to us under 19. So, but if you have multiple sponsors, those sponsors are still responsible for figuring out whether or not they're spending $250 or more on an individual official or employee. Does that make sense? Okay, they can aggregate and you can have multiple sponsors for a conference. It's just the sponsor's required to figure it out. And it requires the designation of all sponsors. So if somebody sends us, and this has happened when they send us a request for a pre-certification, and it's just one sponsor that sent it, and they, with no ill intent, they just didn't include every sponsor, our response is, okay, you've got to report when you spend more than $250 in a day. They're like, oh, wait, but there's multiple sponsors. Well, you've got to designate that for us and let us know. This is a little bit small print. Sorry about that. This is 3625 1.1 is also called lobbying. It's outside of the definitions of lobbying. It's an independent statute, but it essentially makes it the people who are soliciting contracts or trying to get have the state purchase things from them, that it qualifies them as being a lobbyist, and those people have to register. But if you're doing that at the municipal level or the county level, that is still an exception to the definition of lobbying. Okay, does that make sense? Yes.
So if I'm soliciting the DOT for contracts, I should have no register.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Okay, that's why I'm here. Good. Well, you're in the right place. Okay, so this is our website. That's an old screenshot, but we've moved on from 2015. But our website has is very helpful. I'm going to turn this over to Tom for the last his parting thoughts. But
sure. And hang on a minute. Yeah. The reason that shot of the website is up there is because it's a good place for you to go just for general information, specifically as it relates to pre-certifications. On the drop-down screen on our website under pre-certifications, you can find links to all of the documents that have been supplied to us by people who have requested pre-certification. You can see the letter, you can see our response, you can see follow-up questions that we've asked. So if you have a question about how you should structure yours, there are really kind of some models already on the website that you can look at about how other people have done it and what we have pre-certified. That should make it easier for you. Also, we list the date that the event is going to be held. So if you are curious whether there is something that's going to conflict with the event you want to host, you can find that information on our website too. So I have had lobbyists who have said, well, we were going to do it that weekend, or that day, but that's also the same night that Manufacturer Alabama has their big legislative reception, so we've moved it to another night. Also, if we grant pre-certification for an event, and then you later change some aspect of it. Let's say you change the venue or you change the date of it. All you got to do is just let us know what that change is, and we'll update our website to reflect the change in information. Okay. Some parting thoughts. Remember that if you have to update your registration, do it within 10 days of when your registration changes. Let's say that you were a contract lobbyist and you take on somebody new. Update that within 10 days. That is really for your protection, because what happens during the session, inevitably, somebody's going to call over here and say, so-and-so is over here and they're lobbying and they haven't registered on your website as a lobbyist for this entity. That may or may not be true. Generally, when that has happened, it is because the principal has not confirmed that that person is lobbying for them, so we can't list it in our system. You may have informed us that you're doing it, but it will prompt us to call the principal and say, hey, listen, your lobbyist out here is getting beat up because you're not confirming. If they're your lobbyist, please confirm, or at least tell us that they're not. And usually that'll kind of complete the cycle and everything will be okay. But at least make sure you've done what you can do. So I will also say that if you have tasked someone else with the responsibility of filing your stuff for you, that's fine. I would make sure, if it were me, that I eyeballed it before it got submitted, because mistakes get made, and you're the one who's going to be responsible for the disclosure. So just, we have seen it happen before, that somebody said, I'm sorry, we didn't do that. So-and-so was, was looking at this and just didn't put the right information down. And generally that's been an issue when someone else outside of our office has made it an issue, either another lobbyist or maybe somebody with the press or somebody, some outside interest has made it an issue. So again, just a bit of advice, not to stay clean with us, but just to make your life a little bit easier, is I would look at these forms myself and make sure that they're accurate. That pretty much covers everything. Again, if there are questions you have that have not been covered by what we've gone over today, direct them to Vicki.
I was asked by the people in our office who are watching us do this that they can't hear the questions in the audience, and we should have repeated them. So the one question I know was about stacking of lobbyist and principal meals. She asked whether or not it mattered if you were lobbying for different matters. So if you're lobbying them for, if you're each working for a different principal, it doesn't make any difference. You still can't stack. So that's all. That's the only question I can remember. I think there was a question about, yes, sir.
If I'm soliciting the DOT for contracts.
Okay. If he's soliciting the DOT for contracts, does that force him to register as a lobbyist? And the answer is yes, because that's definitionally lobbying according to 3625 1.1.
Yes, to be kind of technical about it, it's executive branch of state government. That's what that opinion turned on, is that the statute says executive branch of state government. And so someone asked, well, if I'm doing it at the local level, does that fall under that statute? And we said no, because it clearly says state level of government. Jim, did you have a question?
A vendor is lobbying DOT, and now they become a lobbyist. But what if they have a lobbyist that they've already hired? Do they need to, or how does that?
I'm sorry, if the...
Well, let's just say I'm representing a company, and the company is trying to get a contract, and I'm working with them to get that contract that represent their company. But then they contact the DOT directly. Do they then need to register separately?
I'm sorry, the vendor contacts DOT directly? Right. What I would tell you is that if that is occurring, ask us specifically to look at your facts and determine whether that person is a lobbyist. Well, clearly, I think I did, because I said if the vendor contacts DOT directly, do they have to register? And the reason is this: clearly, not every single phone call is going to make you a lobbyist. So what we would be interested in is what the substance of the communication is, how often it's occurring, really what you're doing there. And so we would like to be able to look at all those facts before we tell you whether you've got to register. Clearly, we can't assume jurisdiction over somebody that does not fit within the jurisdiction of the Act. So in fairness to that individual, I'd want to look at that in more detail. That's a great question to ask in an informal opinion. Is there another question over here?
I was just asking for a friend.
Okay. Oh, sure. Yeah, he said he was just asking for a friend. That happens a lot. Now, it gives me this opportunity to say, though, you can't ask for an informal opinion for a friend. You can get your friend to ask that informal opinion, but we can't do it for a third party.
Does this all apply to like university employees, the diminished value and the educational dinners and all of that? That also applies to educational employees, like university employees or local?
I think the question is whether the prohibitions under the Act also apply to employees of educational institutions like the University of Alabama or Auburn. They do, because they're public employees. You know, if they're paid in whole or in part out of public money, then they're going to be public employees subject to the Act. And 5.1 says that a thing of value can't be given to a public official or a public employee. there are all kinds of exceptions, as you well know, to cover all this. So just ask whether the conduct falls within one of those exceptions. Yes, ma'am.
Probably a little bit different, but I asked Vicki about professional license. I know a lot of lobbyists are attorneys. What about your nurses and doctors? Are they able to be a lobbyist?
The question was whether certain licensed individuals are able to be lobbyists. Sure. Yeah, in the question was like nurses, or I'm trying to think if there is a nurse who is a registered lobbyist. Yeah, and let me also say this: the restrictions on who can be a lobbyist are generally outside of our act. The regulatory body may have their own rules about who can and cannot. Under our act, elected public officials can't immediately come back and lobby the body that they were a member of for 2 years. So, but that's outside of the question that you asked. And generally, if somebody is lobbying for the nursing association, it is not unreasonable to assume that person may be a registered nurse or a licensed healthcare professional somehow. I mean, I think that's who you would want doing that, right?
Yeah, someone told me I needed to ask at the last minute, and I was like,
Huh.
just ask it.
So you're a nurse?
Yeah.
Did they tell you why you needed to ask? Just to make sure?
No, she actually is retired now, and she was just giving me this long drawn out story about back in her day. And so,
Okay.
yeah, so I just thought I would ask.
Is it because of the liability we have the privilege from the license?
She just said that nurses usually stay out of politics.
Sure. I don't know. That might have been somebody who wanted me to tell you no. I don't know. That happens from time to time too. If it bothers you, just ask the question, and because keep in mind, look, I'm kind of answering this on the fly, but there's nothing that's coming to my mind as I stand here. But if it is of concern to you or to them, all you got to do is ask and give us an opportunity to kind of dig into that a little bit. Okay. Those are great questions, by the way. Any other ones? I'm here as long as you want me. Yes, sir.
What if you're working in the capacity of a consultant for business development and you decide that a legislative agenda may help increase revenue or profit for a company, but you're using a legislative agenda versus maybe a traditional sales approach? Does that make you a lobbyist?
It could. I'll say this. There is a specific exception within our Act for economic development specialists. The question was, and thank you, the question was whether if you were a consultant to a business and there was a legislative agenda that would be beneficial to that business, would that, if you, I guess, had interactions with the legislature about that, would that make you a lobbyist? And my answer to that would be is it could. There is a specific exception within our Act for economic development professionals, and it's a fairly detailed definition. But in summary, if you're not asking for any legislative benefit or action, then I think you're going to fall within that definition of economic development professional, but I'd have to look at that definition to make sure I'm not missing something in that. But under the general definition of lobbying, if you are approaching a legislator and you are asking or advocating for the passage or the defeat of legislation before that body, then you're going to fall within that general definition of lobbyist. And so we would have to look at those exceptions to see which one you are falling in. If you are a lawyer giving advice to your client about the effect of legislation and you're gathering information in order to communicate it back to your client, that falls within an exception. So within that context that you raised, there could be any number of exceptions you could fall under. So we would really want to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But the economic development specialist exception came about 2 sessions ago. It was made final last session in April, I think, of last session. And that's probably the most significant change that's going to get the closest to being an exception for most of your business activity. That's primarily for site selectors, though.
So if you were not viewed as a lobbyist, it would be a principal?
If you're not viewed as a lobbyist and you're not retaining someone else to be your lobbyist, then you very well may fall outside of the act, the operation of the act. That's why that change to the statute was such a big deal. Because if you don't fall within the restrictions of section 5.1, that's you can't give a thing of value or solicit a thing of value, then really the conduct that you're looking at is whether you're trying to corruptly influence somebody's official actions. Okay, and that applies to anybody regardless of whether you're a lobbyist or not. I think it is a very risky game to try to predict whether you are falling outside of 5.1 unless it is abundantly clear that you do. So if you have any doubt at all, what I would say is follow up and ask whether you fall within the definition of lobbyist or not. But again, the background of that economic development specialist exception was really for site selectors who come into the state and are kind of surveying the state for places where they're going to locate businesses, and there's confidentiality that applies to all that economic development activity. That's kind of the background for that. I think the language is a bit broader than that in the way that it was enacted, but it still is pretty narrowly tailored to specific activity. Is that clear enough?
Sure. What if could you be both? I mean, could you have working in capacity with an organization as an economic development?
And be a lobbyist?
And then maybe you're working with another business where you are using more of a traditional lobbying.
Sure. The question is can you occupy both positions, economic development specialist and lobbyist? Maybe not in the same act, but in the course of your daily activities for different people, correct? Okay. I believe that in that exception to the definition, it specifically says that it doesn't apply if you otherwise have to register as a lobbyist.
Okay.
I think that's right, because I remember that being a pretty big deal, but I think if you otherwise have to register as a lobbyist, then you don't get to claim that exception, because the lines are just so close and all that. But that's look, I mean, that's very much an area that, there's certainly over the last year was a lot of talk about, for sure, so. I get that it's probably something that's going to have to be parsed out in various situations, so I'd recommend that you ask that question if you fall into it. Any other questions? All right, well, if y'all don't have any now, and they come up later, direct them to Vicki or to us, and I appreciate your attendance today. Thanks.